There's a strange truth in history. Great kings are remembered with glory, while the ones who raised them, shaped them, and carried their destiny are often forgotten, or worse, turned into monsters. Before Alexander was the Great, before his name was etched across the map of the world, there was a woman standing quietly behind him, weaving that fate. That woman was his mother, Olympias. They called her a witch. They called her a fanatic, cruel, dangerously ambitious. Greek and Roman historians, unaccustomed to a woman daring to enter the brutal game of power, painted her as a venomous serpent on a throne. But that's only half the story. Olympias was not just Alexander's mother. She was the one who instilled in him the belief that he was the son of Zeus, the one who defended his throne when the Macedonian court ran red with blood, and the one who turned her own life into a tragedy so that her son's name could endure forever. And so this is not simply the story of a mother, nor only of a queen, it is the story of the strangest force in history, the power of tragedy. Because sometimes for a king to be born, there must be a woman who carries the weight of all the blood and tears. If you love stories of history filled with tragedy and power, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a journey into the past. Epirus in the 4th century BCE was nothing like the glittering courts of gold or the celebrated city-states of Athens and Sparta. It was a land half wild, half mythical, where mountains loomed over misty valleys, where ancient temples hid among forests and streams, where people still believed the whispers of the gods lingered in the wind that cut through the forting mountains of gods lingered. Trees. Epirus was not a center of civilization, but its remoteness made it a place steeped in legend, where ancient rituals lived on long after Athens had begun to forget them. Olympias was born into this world. She was a princess of the Aeacidae, a dynasty that claimed descent from Achilles, the hero of the Iliad. That bloodline was both a source of pride and a heavy burden binding her to a destiny of war and power. From childhood, Olympias was surrounded by sacred rites, ancestral stories, and the presence of gods. In the rituals of Epirus serpents, symbols of fertility and death were brought into temples as bridges to the other world, and Olympias, with her piercing eyes and uncanny aura, quickly became part of those mysteries. Perhaps it was here in the smoke of incense and the chanting by firelight that a young girl learned to see the world through the lens of myth. To Olympias, power was not just armies or thrones, but communion with the divine, the ability to make others believe in fate. She learned early that women without swords had to wield the fear of the sacred if they were to survive. Her life shifted when Philip II of Macedon entered the picture. He was not a husband in the sense of tragic Greek romance, but a calculation, a strategy. Philip was in the midst of transforming Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into a military power. Marrying Olympias was both political and symbolic, a union that tied Macedonia and Epirus, two lands bound by ancestry, but often strained by conflict. In the ancient world, marriage was rarely about love, but about chains of power. And yet storytellers never fail to note that at least in the beginning there was genuine attraction. Plutarch hints that Philip was enchanted by her beauty and strangeness, so much so that their wedding night was marked by omens. It was said that Philip saw a serpent lying on the bed beside Olympias, and from that moment he began to suspect that his wife had ties to the gods. To us today, it may read as mere symbolism, but in a world steeped in superstition, such an image was enough to turn a woman into something more than human. As Queen of Macedonia, Olympias broke the mold of every woman before her. Macedon was a warrior society, where men governed and women were confined to the shadows. But Olympias refused to stay silent. She was queen priestess and mother of the air all at once. And in that last role she discovered her greatest power, the boy who carried the blood of both Achilles and Zeus. But palace happiness never lasted long. Philip was a man of vast ambition and many women. Political marriages and new lovers gradually pushed Olympias aside. The breaking point came when he married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. Unlike Olympias, Cleopatra was no foreign outsider, and she could bear a son of pure Macedonian blood, a direct threat to both Alexander and his mother. From then on, Olympias's life became a tense drama. She was no longer just Philip's wife, but the enemy of the Macedonian court itself. To the nobles, she was a foreigner, a superstitious woman from Epirus who could not be trusted. They whispered about her snake rituals, her religious zeal, her fierce ambitions for her son. But Olympias did not shrink from the rumors. She turned them into her shield. If they called her a witch, then she would be a witch. If they feared her, that fear itself would be her protection. And remarkably, in a court dominated by men with swords, Olympias was never crushed. She learned to challenge them, to stand tall against those who sought to silence her. Perhaps it was the hostility of the Macedonian court that shaped her into a warrior in her own way. And Alexander, even as a boy, saw it all, saw his mother defy a kingdom, refuse to bow, and believe that the gods had chosen their family for greatness. So when Philip grew distant, when the royal banquets turned into stages for humiliation, Olympias still clung to her hidden power she had planted in Alexander, the belief that he was born not merely to rule, but to conquer the world. That belief would change history. Olympias, the daughter of Epirus, entered Macedon as a despised outsider, mocked, rumored against. But from that position, she built an entirely different foundation of power. Not the power of the sword, but of faith, of fear, and of a maternal devotion that was both tender and terrifying. It was this power that nurtured Alexander the Great, and at the same time it was the seed of her own tragedy. If there was one thing that set Olympias apart from the other women of the Macedonian court, it was her role in raising Alexander. Unlike the queens who handed their children over to wet nurses and tutors, Olympias involved herself in every step of her son's upbringing, as if she had known from the very beginning that he was not just a child but a destiny. Alexander grew up in a world where violence and political intrigue were as common as the air one breathed. But in his earliest years, the first seeds planted in his mind did not come from generals or philosophers, but from his mother. Olympias whispered into his ears stories of Achilles, of Heracles, of Zeus, the heroes and gods whose shadows stretched over her bloodline. She told Alexander that the blood running through his veins was not mortal but divine, and that his fate had already been written among the stars. In these stories there was a strange blend of tender motherhood and fierce ambition. Olympias was the one who held Alexander in her arms, yet also the one who whispered that he was born to rule the world. For a child, a mother's love is eternal, and when that love is bound to the belief that he was the son of Zeus, pride and ambition became not just feelings but a way of life. Alexander did not only learn how to walk, how to wield a sword, he learned how to believe that he carried within him the flame of immortality. Of course, Philip II also played his part in Alexander's education. He brought Aristotle to court, turning Pella into a school of philosophy and strategy. But it was Olympias who built the spiritual framework of the boy. If Aristotle sharpened Alexander's reason, Olympias instilled in him belief, and it was that belief which would push him beyond the limits of ordinary men. Yet Alexander's world was never peaceful. Olympias had to fight early on to protect her son's place. Inside the palace, she was surrounded not by a single enemy, but by a network of rival wives, concubines, and the other children of Philip II. Each new royal marriage was a blade hanging over Alexander's head, and of them all the most dangerous was Cleopatra Eurydice. Unlike Olympias, Cleopatra was pure Macedonian, born into a powerful family and therefore backed by the nobility. When Philip married her, Olympias knew her own position, and her sons had never been so fragile. If Cleopatra were to bear a Prince Alexander, the boy with half-foreign blood from Epirus would be nothing more than a thorn in the eyes of the Macedonian elite. In those days, Olympias and Alexander lived in a court crawling with serpents. Philip's drinking feasts became arenas of insult where one noble openly toasted Cleopatra, wishing that she would bear a king purely Macedonian, unlike Alexander. It is said that the young prince, enraged by those words, drew his sword, while Philip himself leapt to strike his son, only to stumble and collapse drunkenly in front of the table. That scene, a mighty king sprawling in wine, a furious young prince with his sword drawn amid mocking laughter, and a humiliated queen before the eyes of the entire court, was the very symbol of the irreparable fracture within the Macedonian royal family. Olympias did not forget, and neither did Alexander. Every insult, every contemptuous glance from the Macedonian court only deepened the bond between mother and son. In Alexander's eyes, his mother was not only the one who gave him life, but also his ally, his fellow sufferer, and the keeper of a shared dream that one day all who had scorned them would bow down. In those years, a man was being forged. Alexander was not merely a prince, but a boy nurtured by tragedy and ambition, by the knowledge of Aristotle and the fiery whispers of Olympias. It was this strange combination that shaped a character at once rational and dreamlike, brutal and godlike. And within it all, Olympias's shadow was unmistakable, a mother who had turned her love into a weapon to create a king. In 336 BC, Macedonia basked in the glow of victory, yet beneath that radiance, shadows began to swallow the royal court. Philip II had forged a mighty empire, ready to launch his conquest of Persia. But just as his power reached its peak, the fractures within his own household could no longer be hidden. Olympias and Cleopatra Eurydice stood on opposite sides of the divide. One a foreign queen, the other a young Macedonian bride, each embodying a different vision for the throne's future. And caught between them was Alexander, the young prince, both the brightest hope and the gravest threat of all. Philip's boundless ambition had created enemies not only beyond Macedonia's borders, but within his own palace walls. Whispers circulated among the nobles about removing Alexander in favor of a new heir, one who was purely Macedonian. Olympias pushed aside, and watching in silence came to believe during those long sleepless nights that there was only one path left for her son to keep his destiny intact. Philip had to disappear. The moment of fate soon arrived. At the wedding of Philip's daughter to the king of Epirus, a celebration meant to symbolize unity and power, disaster struck. As Philip entered the crowded theatre to the cheers of the guests, one of his bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, drew a dagger and drove it straight into the king. Philip collapsed in the midst of the festivities, blood soaking the floor, while horrified onlookers recoiled in disbelief. Pausanias was quickly pursued and killed, taking with him secrets that would never be revealed. The question echoed through every corner of Macedonia: who truly orchestrated the king's assassination? Some claimed it was nothing more than personal vengeance, that Pausanias had acted out of rage after a personal humiliation. But could wounded pride alone drive a man to murder his king in front of an entire court during one of the most important ceremonies of the realm? Or were unseen hands pulling the strings from the shadows? And in every rumor one name: untold Olympias. Stories spread that in the aftermath of Philip's death, Olympias moved with a chilling, deliberate calm. She placed garlands on the grave of Pausanias, almost as if honoring him as a hero. Toward her rival Cleopatra Eurydice, she showed no mercy. History records her most ruthless act. She ordered the murder of Cleopatra's newborn child, then forced the young woman to take her own life, erasing the greatest threat to Alexander's succession. This was no longer personal vengeance, it was cold, calculated politics clearing the throne for her son. Amid the chaos, Alexander ascended the throne. He was only 20 yet now, king of Macedonia, commander of the strongest army in Greece. But this crown was not passed to him in peace and ritual. It was bathed in the blood of his father, secured by the death of rivals, and shrouded in the fear that gripped the court. In the shadows, Olympias became his political anchor, ensuring no one dared to openly challenge Alexander's rule. And yet this victory was written not only in power but also in tragedy. Even as King Alexander lived under the shadow of an assassination, history would never fully unravel. Did he know his mother had orchestrated his father's death? Or did he simply choose silence, letting fate take its course? History offers no clear answer. But Alexander's silence in the face of these whispers left behind a vast void, one in which the figure of Olympias looms larger than ever. Olympias had done everything to make her son king, but in doing so she had planted a seed of darkness at the very heart of the dynasty, a throne built upon blood and betrayal. And such foundations never last forever. Sooner or later, she too would face the cost of the empire she had helped create. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont to begin his great conquest against Persia, the shadow of Olympias in Macedonia grew at once fainter and more encompassing. Fainter because she was not at the battlefield, not riding beside her son through immortal clashes of arms, yet encompassing because at home she became an unthroned power, a figure everyone had to reckon with, even if no one dared to call her queen. In the vast canvas of the Macedonian Empire, Alexander's departure raised an obvious question: who would rule in the king's absence? The official answer was Antipater, the loyal general entrusted with the administration. But beside him loomed another force, one not recorded in laws or decrees yet present in every decision: Olympias. No one could deny that she had become the mother of the conqueror. In a society that worshipped strength, that title alone gave her an aura bordering on the divine. Each time Alexander won a great battle, each time news of his victories reached Macedonia, the people did not only praise their young king, but whispered of the woman who bore him, the woman who had planted in him the conviction of divine destiny. In festivals, she was honored alongside Alexander, as if his triumphs were proof of the sacred power she always claimed. Olympias made use of this. She wrote letters to Alexander not only as a mother offering affection, but to remind him that he was truly the son of Zeus, that every victory came not merely from skill but from fate itself. According to Plutarch, her letters were sometimes so blunt, so intrusive, that Alexander complained she demanded more authority than the whole court. Yet even his complaints revealed something crucial. Olympias never considered herself outside the realm of politics. She saw herself as part of her son's conquest, even from thousands of miles away. In Macedonia, she became the center of religious life. She revived the cult of Dionysus and rituals involving serpents, practices that left the Macedonian court both wary and unable to ignore her. To common people, she was the embodiment of divine power, a figure both feared and revered. To the nobility, she was a threat, but also a symbol they could not dislodge. Her presence, though unofficial, created a strange balance. Antipater had the army and the machinery of state, but Olympias commanded the people and the weight of symbolism. Antipater stood for discipline and order, while Olympias was the wind of myth, a force no one dared openly oppose. The two, one pragmatic general, one mystical queen mother, occupied the same political space like opposite poles that could not merge yet could not expel each other. In the early years of Alexander's campaign, this tension remained unspoken. Olympias did not directly confront Antipater, and Antipater did not dare challenge the king's mother. But behind the scenes, everyone knew Macedonia was ruled not only by the man who held the sword, but also by the woman who carried the mantle of divine destiny. During this time, Olympias seemed to live two lives. One was that of a mother anxious for her son, writing letters filled with affection, praying to the gods for his safety. The other was that of a queen in the shadows, orchestrating rituals, securing her political standing, quietly preparing for any upheaval that might come. She knew power was fragile, and in Macedonia, a single misstep could cost her son his throne. That is why Olympias never truly stepped back. Even as Alexander shook the foundations of Asia, she ensured that back home her name was never forgotten. And in a world where power was shaped by memory and fear, that was the deadliest weapon she possessed. There is a strange paradox in the nature of power. When the most powerful man in the world is busy conquering distant lands, it is often the weaker figures left at home who stir the undercurrents that decide the fate of an empire. In the case of Alexander the Great in Macedonia, that undercurrent bore a single name: Olympias. As Alexander marched deeper into Asia, his fame thundered across the Mediterranean, but the growing distance soon became more than geographical, it became spiritual. Olympias still received letters from her son, letters where Alexander not only boasted of his dazzling victories, but also underlined his divine destiny as the son of Zeus. Yet, for his mother, those words were both a source of pride and a cold knife. She saw Alexander drifting further away, transforming into a god-king in his own imagination, while she, the very one who had first planted those mythic beliefs in him, was left behind in the cold walls of Pella. That vacuum of power quickly turned into fertile ground for conflict. In Macedonia, Antipater, a seasoned general, had been appointed regent by Alexander. Antipater was no man to be manipulated. He was a veteran soldier, well versed in the machinery of court politics, and he had little patience for Olympias's interference. To her, however, Antipater was a dangerous threat. She was accustomed to holding the reins of the royal household, to bending men with a mixture of iron will and cunning. But Antipater was different. He was immune to both her authority and her intimidation. Instead, he built a power structure of his own, gradually pushing Olympias to the margins. The letters from Alexander became her political weapons. Olympias made no secret of her son's praises, parading them as proof that she was not only the mother of the king but also the spark that ignited his divine mission. Yet Antipater remained unmoved. He fortified the army, managed the administration, controlled the finances, and piece by piece created a kingdom within the kingdom, where Olympias was reduced to more of a mythic symbol than a force of real power. The fracture spread beyond politics into the everyday life of the court. Macedonian nobles, once cowed by Olympias's fiery gaze, began to choose sides. Some still clung to her, believing that only the blood of Epirus and her sacred link to Alexander guaranteed true legitimacy. But many more turned to Antipater as a symbol of stability. To them, Olympias represented a mystical past, while Antipater embodied the practical present needed to hold the empire together in Alexander's absence. Olympias responded in the way she always had, by doubling down on myth and ritual. She staged public religious ceremonies, presided over serpent sacrifices, even encouraged rumors that she communed with the gods. Through this, she sought to remind everyone that no Antipater could ever rival the divine blood flowing in her veins. But the more she immersed herself in this mystical theatre, the more she appeared to the pragmatic men of court as a nuisance, a relic of superstition, in an age governed by steel and strategy. Those small cracks widened into deep chasms. Olympias, trapped in her loneliness and pride, the harder she fought to cling to influence, the more isolated she became. Alexander, far away, seemed barely concerned. He pressed on with his conquests, leaving his mother locked in a silent yet brutal struggle with Antipater. It was a bitter irony the woman who had crafted a god-king now found herself pushed to the fringes of the very court she had helped build. And within that contradiction, the first flashes of the coming tragedy had already begun to spark. When Alexander the Great drew his final breath in 323 BC, the world seemed to fall silent. The man who had conquered from Greece to the edges of India, the man Olympias had raised to believe he was the son of Zeus himself, was gone at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire so vast, no one could even imagine how to govern it. And in that moment, a woman long confined to the shadows stepped forward into the spotlight of history. Her name was Olympias. News of Alexander's death spread swiftly, and with it came a question that shook the empire to its core: who would succeed him? For in his final hours, Alexander had left no clear heir. He had a wife, Roxana, who was pregnant, and a half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, regarded as weak of mind. The Game of Thrones had begun, and as always, Olympias would not remain a bystander. She was no longer simply the mother of the greatest king, but now the grandmother of the last hope, the unborn child inside Roxana. Olympias saw in that child a fragile but legitimate thread to carry forward Alexander's legacy. An infant not yet born, yet already bearing the fate of an empire. And just as she had once done with Alexander, Olympias swore to protect, nurture, and shape this new life into her instrument of power. Meanwhile, the empire crumbled into chaos. The Diadochi, The generals who had once fought under Alexander turned on each other in a violent scramble for power. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Antigonus, names that would later be carved into the map of history, were at that moment nothing more than ambitious men tearing apart a garment far too large for any of them to wear. But Olympias wielded a different kind of weapon, the power of blood. She did not command armies, but she held something they could never dismiss, the royal legitimacy of the Argead line. Olympias quickly became the anchor for Roxana. The young Persian woman, a stranger in a court, riddled with plots, had no choice but to lean on her formidable mother-in-law for survival. To the Macedonian generals, Roxana was nothing but Olympias, transformed her into the most crucial piece on the political chessboard. When Roxana gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, hope and danger arrived together in the palace. Olympias knew well that the child's very existence would never be tolerated easily. Such a sprawling empire demanded a firm hand, and no one wanted to wait decades for a child to grow into a man. Yet Olympias, unshaken in her belief that her family carried the blood of Zeus, clung to the conviction that this was the only true path to preserve Alexander's legacy. If the world would not accept it, then she would force it to. From her homeland of Epirus, Olympias began sending letters, forging alliances, weaving a political web in the shadows. No longer merely a grieving mother, she was becoming the hidden power behind the throne. People began to call her the Queen in the shadows. But those shadows were spreading further and further over Macedonia. Her life in those years was one of constant tension. She knew every power in the empire saw Alexander IV as an obstacle to be removed. She understood that she herself was little more than a marked target for 1,000 daggers. But in that danger, Olympias's survival instincts and hunger for power only sharpened. She did not guard her grandson as a helpless child, but as the single torch proving that Alexander the Great had not truly died, but still lived on in blood and in memory. And so, from a mother once mocked as mad for believing her son, divine Olympias transformed into the most powerful grandmother of ancient Greece. A woman who turned bloodline and motherhood into weapons of politics. But as with every fire fueled by ambition and blood, her power could never remain simply protective. Inevitably, it would turn toward vengeance, and then toward violence. Nothing is more dangerous than a woman who has tasted both power and loss. Olympias entered the final stage of her life, no longer as a protective mother or a devout priestess, but as a ruthless judge of fate. After Alexander's death, she had tried to keep some fragile balance between motherhood, religion, and politics. But by 317 BC, those layers had fallen away. What remained was a soul set ablaze, ready to burn every enemy in her path. As the wars of the Diadochi reached their peak, Olympias saw her chance to reclaim influence. She returned to Macedonia, no longer confined to the shadows of the royal household, but openly proclaiming herself guardian of her grandson Alexander IV. The boy hailed as the legitimate heir to the conqueror's bloodline. By standing behind him, she draped herself once more in the cloak of power, forcing every faction to acknowledge that the blood of Alexander the Great still flowed in the dynasty. Yet everyone understood who truly pulled the strings: Olympias herself. Her first target was Philip III, Aridaeus Alexander's half-brother. The intellectually disabled king, long manipulated as a political pawn, was to Olympias nothing but a symbol of weakness and humiliation. She did not see a man but a threat, a banner under which her enemies could rally. And in the game of power, a false banner was more dangerous than 1,000 swords. So Olympias ordered the execution of Philip III and his wife Eurydice. Legend says Eurydice was forced to take her own life, and before her death she was humiliated, so that her final moments stood as a warning to any woman bold enough to oppose the woman of Zeus. But Olympias did not stop there. She unleashed a wave of bloodshed, executing hundreds of nobles, generals, and loyalists of the rival factions. Macedonian squares ran red, while she stood watching her gaze, unflinching her lips, murmuring prayers as if the gods themselves had entrusted her with judgment. It was said that Olympias turned executions into rituals where politics fused with religion, and death became a symbol of purification. From that moment on, her image was forever transformed. Once she had been seen as a protective mother, a betrayed wife, a priestess, bound to sacred mysteries. Now she appeared as a bloodthirsty tyrant, no different from the despots she once despised. And yet one must step into her shoes to understand the cruel logic of it all. In a shattered empire, mercy was the dagger aimed at your own chest. Only blood could secure her grandson's throne. Only ruthlessness could silence her enemies. Olympias became a queen of cruelty, not because she desired it, but because the game of power offered her no other choice. Still, her brutality carried the seeds of her downfall. When the executions became too many, fear curdled into hatred. Families of the slain, exiled generals and once loyal officers of Alexander swore revenge on the woman who had turned Macedonia into a graveyard. In that heavy silence, dripping with blood, the shadow of betrayal crept closer. Olympias by then was like a fire blazing one last time before burning out. She had proven to the world that a woman could bend the fate of an empire. But in doing so, she had transformed herself into the figure cursed by her own court. The name Olympias, once remembered simply as the mother of Alexander, was now carved into history as the emblem of bloodlust and boundless power. When Alexander still lived, Olympias was shielded by the radiance of her invincible sun. After his death, she could still cling to his name as if it were a shield of her own. But time, like a dull yet merciless blade, slowly cut away at her power. The 322nd BCE unfolded as a bloody chessboard where the Diadochi generals fought to claim the light of Alexander for themselves. Olympias, sharp and resolute, managed to hold her ground for quite some time, but eventually the wheel of power turned elsewhere. Antipater, the man who had been her greatest rival, died in 319 BCE. At first glance, his death seemed to open a door. Yet that door did not lead to freedom, but to the abyss. Before his death, Antipater passed power to his son Cassander, a cold, ambitious young man who hated Olympias even more deeply than his father had. Cassander knew that if he wanted to secure his position, he had to eliminate the last living symbols of the Argead dynasty, Olympias herself, and her young grandson, Alexander IV, son of the great conqueror. At more than 60 years old, Olympias suddenly became the prime target in a deadly game. At first, she still held some power. In Epirus and Macedonia, many remained loyal, remembering she had once been the wife of a king, the mother of a king, and now the grandmother of the rightful king. Olympias never lost her fierce spirit. When Cassander marched with his army, she stood before her troops, her voice strong and commanding, invoking Alexander's name, recalling his victories, reminding them that betrayal was not against a woman, but against the glory of an empire. Yet courage could not change a simple truth. Power was no longer hers. Cassander laid siege with patience, cutting off supplies bit by bit. He understood that great symbols collapse less from swords than from rot within, and it happened exactly so. Soldiers who had once sworn to die for Olympias began to waver. They whispered among themselves, Alexander was dead, his age of triumph gone, and this old queen could bring them nothing but a useless death. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear of the stronger hand wore them down. At last, when Cassander advanced, Olympias's men opened the gates. That betrayal must have cut deeper than any blade. Olympias was captured, and Cassander seized the chance to turn victory into public vengeance. A sham trial was staged, though the verdict had been written long before. The charges rained down. She was accused of murdering Philip III, Aridaeus, of executing nobles, of spreading violence through the court. Olympias denied nothing, nor did she beg. Instead, she held herself with almost arrogant defiance. Sources tell us that even under threat, she looked her enemies in the eye, naming Cassander and his father as cowardly usurpers. Cassander hesitated. He knew that killing the mother of Alexander the Great was no simple act. She remained a symbol, and her death could ignite fury. Yet he also understood that as long as she lived, his rule would never be secure. In the end, he ordered her execution. Bitterly, he did not dare to kill her himself, nor let his soldiers do it. Instead, he allowed the relatives of those Olympias had once condemned to carry out the deed. Even they faltered. After all, this was still Alexander's mother, still the woman who had once been feared across the empire. Many raised their swords, only to let them fall unable to strike. At last, a handful of enemies steeled themselves to finish it. Olympias did not plead, did not weep. She walked to her death, as though stepping onto a final stage, regal pride unbroken. Blades cut her down and her body collapsed onto the cold earth. Cassander, to add insult to injury, ordered her corpse left unburied, denying her the honor of a tomb. The woman once revered as the mother of the great king, once called the Queen in the Shadows, now lay abandoned without grave or mourning. The death of Olympias was more than the end of a life. It was a mirror, reflecting the cruelty of the post-Alexander world. She had been celebrated, had held the fate of kingdoms in her hands, had moved thrones like pawns, had chosen who lived and who died. Yet in a moment it all dissolved. She died, betrayed, disgraced, and alone. But Olympias cannot be seen only as a victim. Her brutal end was also the consequence of a lifetime spent playing the game of power. She had shed blood-sown hatred and chosen a path of no retreat. Perhaps she knew from the beginning that there could be no other ending. From the moment Alexander was born, and she resolved to shape him into a child of destiny, Olympias accepted that her life would never be quiet. Glory carried its price, and her final price was a death no one could prevent. History still debates her. Was she a hero or a villain, a devoted mother or a tyrant? Yet one truth stands firm: she lived and died as a true, tragic figure. The tragedy was not only that she was slain, but that she had once stood at the summit holding the world in her grasp, through her son, only to fall into the abyss of oblivion. If Alexander was remembered as a godlike king, then Olympias stands as the reminder that behind every myth there are mortals who bleed, who suffer, and who pay the price. Olympias was dead, her body left exposed to the elements as a final insult, yet her story did not end there. In truth, that was only the beginning of a debate that has lasted more than 2,000 years. A struggle among later generations to define the legacy of a woman who dared to step out of the shadows in a world ruled by men. In the political memory of her time, Olympias was quickly turned into a symbol of cruelty. Cassander, the man who killed her, did not simply eliminate a rival. He deliberately tarnished her reputation, carving into history the image of a cunning witch and a bloodthirsty queen. He spread tales of bizarre rituals in which Olympias kept snakes in her palace, of how she manipulated Alexander with sinister whispers of executions she personally ordered with cold precision. Each detail, exaggerated and embroidered for political purposes, painted her as a dangerous outsider, a woman who did not belong in the established order of Macedonia. And yet if we step back and look at Olympias from the distance of history, we see something different. She was not simply bloodthirsty. Olympias was a woman born into a world where power was measured by the sword and loyalty was written in blood. She saw her husband, Philip II, cut down by an assassin's dagger before her very eyes. She watched her son Alexander hurl himself into endless wars where death was always waiting. In such a world, ruthlessness was not a choice, it was survival. Modern historians, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, have begun to reinterpret her life through another lens. They point out that while men like Antipater Cassander, or even Philip II, could massacre thousands and still be praised as brilliant statesmen, Olympias was vilified for doing much the same, simply because she was a woman. Gender prejudice cannot be ignored here. The Greeks and Macedonians had long dismissed women in politics, and the fact that one not only entered that realm but ruled it, however, briefly provoked fury far beyond measure. For many scholars, Olympias marks the beginning of a new model of female political power in the Greek and Hellenistic world. She blazed the trail, later followed by queens such as Cleopatra of Egypt and Laodice of the Seleucid dynasty. These women understood that power was never handed to them. It had to be seized with both cunning and ruthlessness. Without a precedent like Olympias, they might never have found a mirror in which to see their own ambitions. Another dimension of Olympias's legacy lies in her relationship with her son Alexander. Though war often kept them apart, letters and memories suggest she was his greatest source of inspiration. It was she who planted in his mind the belief that he was the son of Zeus, destined for world conquest. Without her fierce conviction, Alexander might never have carried the almost mad pride that drove him past every boundary. Some even claim that his victories were the spiritual inheritance of Olympias, and that he was merely the hand carrying out the visions she had instilled. But that bond also gave rise to darker interpretations. Traditional historians accused Olympias of poisoning Alexander's mind, filling him with the delusion that he was divine rather than mortal. If she was the one who seeded his sense of immortality, then it was that very illusion that drove him to an early death, leaving behind an empire too vast to govern and plunging the world into chaos. In this sense, her legacy may be seen not only in power and blood, but in the inevitable collapse of Alexander's empire. When Roman and medieval writers recalled her name, Olympias was usually cast as a cautionary figure, a woman whose power turned into sin. But in modern literature, she sometimes emerges as an early symbol of female defiance, a woman who dared to challenge the order of men to protect her family and her dynasty. Her image is at once tragic and magnificent, like a ghost still haunting the memory of history. Today, when we speak of Olympias, we cannot reduce her to a witch or a tyrant queen. She stands as proof of the bitter truth that history is never written in black and white. Olympias was a fusion of motherhood and ambition of faith and obsession of love and blood. She was not wholly victim nor wholly villain. She was the product of a world where only the hardest survived, and she paid a steep price for being one of them. Perhaps Olympias's greatest legacy is the reminder that power never comes without blood, and that women who step into the game will always be judged far more harshly than men. Yet within that judgment her shadow still looms, enduring unbroken, a testament that there were women strong enough to shake the world of kings.